when chosen rather than imposed, is one of the clearest external signals of internal self-control. Psychology consistently links self-control with competence, authority, and strength because it implies mastery over impulse. Most human communication is reactive. People speak to discharge emotion, to reduce anxiety, to assert relevance, or to seek validation. When someone resists this impulse and speaks only when necessary, the mind of the observer interprets that restraint as evidence of higher regulation. The assumption is simple but powerful. If a person can control their words, they can likely control their emotions, decisions, and behavior. That assumption alone elevates perceived status before a single idea is even evaluated. The brain is constantly scanning for cues of stability and threat. Loudness, urgency, and excessive explanation often register as instability, even when the content itself is intelligent. This happens because urgency suggests internal pressure. Pressure implies dependence on outcome. Dependence reduces perceived power. Silence, on the other hand, suggests independence from immediate approval or reaction. When someone does not rush to speak, the subconscious inference is that they are not desperate for control of the interaction. They are comfortable letting events unfold. Comfort in uncertainty is a hallmark of psychological strength. Most people scroll past ideas like this without noticing. If you didn't, subscribe. It means you're paying attention when others choose comfort over awareness. Self-control is also deeply tied to delayed gratification. Speaking less often means resisting the immediate reward of expression. Talking releases tension. It provides social reassurance. It gives the speaker a sense of presence and influence in the moment. Choosing silence delays that gratification. The brain associates the ability to delay gratification with maturity, leadership, and long-term orientation. This is why people instinctively defer to individuals who appear calm and measured in high-pressure situations. Their silence signals that they are not governed by impulse but by intention. Another critical layer is predictability. People who speak excessively reveal their internal state quickly. Their emotions, opinions, and reactions become easy to map. Predictability reduces authority because it makes behavior easy to anticipate and manage. Silence introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty forces attention. When someone does not immediately reveal their thoughts, others become more alert to their presence. They listen more carefully. They assign more significance to the eventual response. This is not manipulation. It is a natural cognitive response to withheld information. Silence also communicates confidence in one's own position. A person who truly believes in their value does not feel compelled to defend it constantly. They do not over-justify their choices or preempt criticism with explanation. Over-explaining is often a subconscious attempt to secure agreement before it is threatened. Strong individuals tolerate disagreement without feeling the need to neutralize it verbally. Their silence communicates that they do not equate opposition with danger. This tolerance is read as strength because it implies a stable self-concept. From a neurological perspective, emotional self-control is visible through speech patterns. Heightened emotional arousal increases verbal output. People speak faster, louder, and more frequently when emotionally activated. A reduced verbal footprint during challenging moments signals nervous system regulation. The observer's brain picks up on this regulation and mirrors it. Calm speech or deliberate silence lowers perceived threat and increases trust. Trust is a prerequisite for respect. People respect those who make them feel psychologically safe while remaining clearly grounded. There is also a social hierarchy component. In most group dynamics, lower status individuals speak more to establish relevance, while higher status individuals speak less because their relevance is assumed. This pattern appears across cultures, workplaces, and social groups. When someone speaks less but is still listened to, the group unconsciously categorizes them as higher status. Their words are treated as decisions rather than opinions. This effect compounds over time. Each instance of restrained speech reinforces the perception of authority, making future silence even more powerful. Silence further protects against self-sabotage. Words cannot be taken back. Speaking impulsively increases the risk of revealing insecurity, uncertainty, or emotional reactivity. Strong people understand this intuitively. They create a buffer between stimulus and response. That buffer is silence. In that pause, they assess context, intent, and consequence. Observers may not consciously register this process, but they feel its effects. Responses that arrive after a pause tend to be clearer, firmer, and more precise. Precision is another trait strongly associated with competence. Importantly, silence does not mean passivity. There is a difference between absence and restraint. Passive silence comes from fear or disengagement. Controlled silence comes from choice. The distinction is felt immediately in body language, eye contact, and posture. A self-controlled silence is accompanied by presence. The individual remains engaged, observant, and attentive. This combination of quiet and awareness creates a subtle pressure in social interactions. Others feel seen without being confronted. That sensation often leads them to self-regulate, speak more carefully, or seek approval, further reinforcing the silent individual's perceived strength. Silence also shifts conversational power. The person who speaks less often sets the pace. They decide when the interaction advances. They are not pulled by the urgency of others. This pacing communicates dominance without aggression. Aggression seeks to control externally. Self-control demonstrates control internally. Psychology consistently ranks internal control as a more stable and respected form of power. People may comply with aggression, but they respect restraint. Another overlooked aspect is that silence allows for better listening. Listening is not passive, it is data collection. Strong people prioritize understanding over expression. By listening more than they speak, they gain insight into motivations, insecurities, and intentions. This knowledge increases their effectiveness in future interactions. Observers sense this attentiveness and often feel that the silent person understands more than they say. That perception alone enhances respect, because being understood is a deep psychological need. Over time, saying less creates a consistent identity. The individual becomes known as someone whose words matter. This reputation does not form through occasional silence, but through repeated restraint. Each time a person chooses not to speak unnecessarily, they reinforce the association between their voice and significance. Eventually, when they do speak, the room adjusts. Attention shifts. Silence precedes their words because it has trained others to wait. That training is not deliberate. It is psychological conditioning shaped by consistent self-control. At its core, silence signals that a person is not controlled by their impulses, emotions, or need for approval. It communicates inner order. Humans instinctively respect order because it suggests reliability and strength. In environments full of noise, reactivity, and constant expression, restraint stands out as competence. The absence of unnecessary words becomes evidence of internal discipline, and discipline is one of the most universally respected human traits. When people speak less, their words gain disproportionate weight because human perception is governed by value attribution rather than raw information. Psychology shows that value is rarely assigned based on quantity, it is assigned based on scarcity. Anything that is abundant is assumed to be easily replaceable. Anything that is rare is assumed to be important. Language follows the same rule. When someone speaks frequently, their words blend into the background of the interaction. When someone speaks selectively, each contribution stands out. The mind does not consciously calculate this, but it responds to it automatically by paying closer attention and assigning greater significance to what is said. Most people underestimate how quickly familiarity erodes impact. The more someone talks, the more predictable they become. Predictability reduces cognitive effort for the listener. When the brain no longer needs to work to interpret meaning, attention drops. This is why constant talkers are often ignored, even when their ideas are sound. The issue is not intelligence or insight, it is saturation. Words lose their edge when they are constantly available. Speaking less preserves novelty, and novelty activates attention systems in the brain. Attention is the gateway to respect. There is also an expectancy effect at play. When a person rarely speaks, the listener develops an expectation that when they do speak, it will be worth hearing. This expectation changes the listening posture. People lean in mentally. They suspend interruption. They process more deeply. The same sentence delivered by a frequent speaker and a restrained speaker will be received differently, not because of content, but because of content. Context shapes meaning before words even arrive. Scarcity also interacts with authority perception. In social hierarchies, high-status individuals are not expected to explain themselves constantly. Their words are treated as decisions rather than proposals. Low-status individuals feel pressure to justify, clarify, and persuade. When someone speaks less, they unconsciously align themselves with high-status communication patterns. Observers may not articulate this, but they feel it. The restrained speaker appears more certain, more grounded, and more decisive. Even silence between sentences can create a sense of deliberation, as though thought is happening beneath the surface. Another psychological factor is cognitive load. Conversations demand mental energy. When someone floods an interaction with words, they increase the listener's processing burden. The brain responds to overload by disengaging. Shorter, well-timed statements reduce cognitive strain. They feel cleaner, more efficient, and more intelligent. The listener experiences relief rather than fatigue. Relief is associated with competence. People respect those who make understanding easier, not harder. Speaking less also increases interpretive depth. When information is incomplete, the mind fills in gaps. This is a fundamental cognitive tendency. When someone says just enough, listeners project meaning, intelligence, and intention onto the message. The speaker is credited for thoughts they never verbalized. This projection often works in the speaker's favor because people tend to assume coherence and depth when cues are limited. Over-explaining removes this advantage by forcing all meaning into explicit form, leaving nothing for interpretation. There is also a temporal dimension to value. Words that arrive too quickly feel cheap because they required little time or reflection. Words that arrive after a pause feel considered. Time invested in response increases perceived quality. This is why delayed replies often feel more important than immediate ones, even in written communication. The delay signals prioritization and discernment. When someone speaks less, their timing becomes more noticeable. Timing amplifies value. From a psychological safety perspective, restrained speech also communicates confidence. A person who believes their words matter does not rush to deploy them. They trust that silence will not diminish their standing. This trust is read as self-assurance. In contrast, excessive speech can signal anxiety about being overlooked or misunderstood. Anxiety undermines authority. When words are scarce, they appear intentional rather than compulsive. Another key element is contrast. Value is created through contrast, not isolation. Silence creates contrast for speech. Without silence, speech becomes noise. When a person alternates between listening and brief, precise contributions, the contrast heightens impact. Each statement feels like an event rather than background commentary. The brain marks it as relevant because it breaks the pattern. Pattern interruption is a powerful attention mechanism, and attention precedes respect. Speaking less also protects meaning. Language is a blunt instrument. The more it is used, the more opportunities there are for misinterpretation, dilution, or contradiction. Strong communicators understand that clarity often comes from omission rather than addition. By saying only what is necessary, they reduce ambiguity. Reduced ambiguity increases trust. People trust what feels clean and intentional. Socially, less speech also changes power dynamics. The person who talks less often controls the floor indirectly. Others fill the silence, revealing their thoughts, positions, and emotions. The restrained speaker gains information while giving away little. Information asymmetry increases influence. Influence increases respect. This dynamic does not require manipulation. It emerges naturally when one person resists the urge to fill space. There is also an emotional economy involved. Words carry emotional charge. When someone speaks constantly, their emotional signals fluctuate and bleed into the interaction. This volatility reduces stability. When someone speaks less, their emotional output is steadier. Steadiness is associated with leadership and maturity. People feel more secure around those whose emotional signals are minimal and consistent. Over time, a reputation forms. The individual becomes known as someone who does not waste words. This reputation compounds. Even before they speak, their silence is interpreted as thoughtfulness. When they finally contribute, the contribution is framed by expectation. Expectation magnifies impact. This is why a few words from a respected figure can outweigh long explanations from others. Importantly, saying less does not mean withholding value. It means delivering value in concentrated form. Precision replaces volume. Precision signals mastery. Mastery commands respect. The brain recognizes efficiency as a marker of expertise. Experts say more with less because they understand the core of what matters. Novices speak more because they are still circling the point. Ultimately, the perceived value of words is not determined by eloquence alone, but by restraint, timing, and scarcity. When speech is selective, it feels intentional. When it feels intentional, it feels important. When it feels important, people remember it, respond to it, and respect the person who delivered it. Strong people do not seek validation because validation places power outside the self, and psychology consistently shows that authority weakens when approval becomes a requirement rather than a byproduct. Validation-seeking behavior is rooted in uncertainty about one's own position. When someone explains too much, justifies preemptively, or looks for reassurance after expressing a thought, they are signaling that their internal conviction is not sufficient on its own. The listener may not consciously judge this, but the signal is registered subconsciously. The mind interprets the need for validation as dependence, and dependence lowers perceived strength. Over-explaining is one of the most common expressions of validation seeking. It often masquerades as clarity or politeness, but psychologically it functions as a defensive behavior. The person is attempting to control how their words are received by eliminating ambiguity, objections, or disagreement before they arise. This effort reveals anxiety about how the message will land. Anxiety communicates risk. When a speaker appears concerned about being accepted, the listener instinctively positions themselves as the evaluator rather than the equal. The balance of power shifts quietly but decisively. Strong individuals tolerate being misunderstood, disagreed with, or even disliked without rushing to correct perception. This tolerance is not indifference, it is confidence in self-definition. They did not need immediate alignment to feel secure. Psychology links this trait to a stable internal locus of control, where self-worth is regulated internally rather than externally. People with an internal locus of control are perceived as more competent, more resilient, and more trustworthy. Their words carry weight because they are not contingent on approval. Validation seeking also increases cognitive noise. When someone explains excessively, they dilute the core message. The listener must sift through qualifiers, disclaimers, and emotional padding to extract meaning. This effort reduces clarity and impact. In contrast, strong communicators state their position cleanly and allow it to stand. The absence of justification implies certainty. Certainty does not require defense. The mind associates undefended statements with confidence, even when the content is complex. Another psychological mechanism at play is reactance. When people sense that a speaker is trying too hard to persuade or secure agreement, they experience subtle resistance. The listener's autonomy feels threatened, even if the intention is benign. Over-explaining can trigger this resistance because it feels like pressure. Strong individuals avoid this trap by allowing others the freedom to interpret, question, or reject what is said. Paradoxically, this freedom increases receptivity. Respect grows when people feel they are choosing to agree rather than being steered toward agreement. Strong people also understand that validation seeking erodes credibility over time. Each time someone seeks reassurance, they train others to see them as uncertain. This pattern compounds. Eventually, even confident statements are filtered through the expectation of doubt. In contrast, those who consistently refrain from seeking validation build a reputation for self-assurance. Their silence after speaking is as important as the words themselves. It communicates finality, not because discussion is closed, but because their sense of self is not dependent on the outcome. Emotional regulation is deeply intertwined with this principle. Validation seeking often arises from discomfort with tension. Disagreement creates tension. Silence after a statement creates tension. Strong individuals allow this tension to exist without rushing to relieve it. They understand that tension is not inherently negative. In fact, it often signals that something meaningful has been introduced into the interaction. By not rushing to soothe that discomfort with explanation or reassurance, they demonstrate emotional resilience. Emotional resilience is consistently interpreted as strength. There is also an identity component. People who seek validation frequently define themselves through others' responses. Their sense of competence fluctuates based on feedback. This makes their behavior more reactive and less predictable. Strong individuals anchor identity internally. Feedback informs them, but it does not define them. This anchoring allows them to remain steady across different social contexts. Steadiness is rare, and rarity attracts respect. In social hierarchies, those who seek validation often occupy lower positions, not because they lack ability, but because their communication style signals deference. Asking for approval, overqualifying opinions, or repeatedly checking for agreement subtly places the speaker below the listener. Strong people do not perform this deference unless strategically chosen. They speak as though their perspective has inherent legitimacy. This posture invites engagement on equal terms rather than evaluation from above. Over-explaining also reveals fear of judgment. Fear narrows perception. When someone speaks from a place of fear, their language becomes cautious, layered, and hedged. This language lacks decisiveness. Decisiveness is a key marker of leadership and strength. Even when a decision is imperfect, decisiveness communicates the ability to act under uncertainty. Strong individuals accept the risk of being wrong without cushioning every statement. This acceptance signals courage, another trait deeply tied to respect. There is a social cost to validation seeking that often goes unnoticed. When one person constantly seeks reassurance, others begin to feel responsible for their emotional state. This creates subtle fatigue. People prefer interactions where emotional responsibility is balanced. Strong individuals manage their own emotional responses, freeing others from the burden of reassurance. This makes them easier to be around and more respected in group dynamics. Another important aspect is that validation seeking shifts focus away from substance and toward perception management. The speaker becomes preoccupied with how they are seen rather than what is being conveyed. This reduces depth. Strong people prioritize substance over perception. They trust that clarity and integrity will speak for themselves over time. This long-term orientation contrasts sharply with the short-term relief validation provides. Long-term orientation is associated with maturity and leadership. Silence after speaking plays a crucial role here. When someone states an idea and then remains silent, they communicate that the idea does not require immediate reinforcement. The listener is given space to process. This space subtly transfers responsibility to the listener. The listener must now respond, reflect, or challenge. This shift elevates the speaker's position. Validation seeking would reverse this by pulling responsibility back onto the speaker to justify or soften the message. Strong people also understand that not every thought requires affirmation to be valid. They are comfortable holding opinions privately, expressing them selectively, and allowing them to evolve without public confirmation. This discretion prevents over-identification with any single statement. Over-identification often drives validation seeking because criticism feels like a personal threat. When identity is not fused with every expressed thought, criticism becomes information rather than injury. At a deeper psychological level, validation seeking keeps the nervous system in a heightened state. The individual is constantly scanning for feedback, approval, or rejection. This vigilance consumes cognitive and emotional resources. Strong individuals conserve these resources by regulating internally. Their communication reflects this conservation. It is economical, grounded, and unhurried. People sense this efficiency and associate it with competence. Ultimately, the absence of validation seeking communicates self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is not isolation. It is stability. When a person appears stable within themselves, others instinctively trust their judgment more. Trust leads to influence. Influence leads to respect. This chain does not require loud confidence or dominance. It emerges quietly from the consistent refusal to outsource self-worth to the reactions of others. Emotional regulation is one of the most reliable signals of strength because it demonstrates mastery over internal reactions rather than attempts to control external circumstances. Psychology consistently shows that people do not respect those who feel the most. They respect those who can manage what they feel. When someone remains calm under pressure, the observer's mind interprets that calmness as evidence of competence, confidence, and control. This interpretation happens instinctively, long before logic evaluates what is actually being said or done. Human beings are wired to read emotional cues as indicators of safety or threat. Elevated emotional expression, raised voice, hurried speech, visible frustration, defensiveness activates the nervous system of others. It suggests volatility and unpredictability. Even when the emotion is justified, its uncontrolled expression creates psychological discomfort in the people witnessing it. Discomfort reduces trust. Calmness, by contrast, lowers perceived threat. A regulated emotional state tells others that the situation is being handled, not endured. That signal alone commands respect. Calm presence also implies internal hierarchy. A person who can regulate their emotions is not being ruled by the moment. They are choosing how to respond rather than reacting automatically. This choice implies psychological distance from the stimulus. Distance creates perspective. Perspective is associated with wisdom and leadership. People instinctively look to those who appear to see more clearly when emotions run high. The individual who remains composed becomes a reference point for stability, even if they say very little. One of the reasons calmness is so powerful is that it disrupts expectation. In tense situations, people anticipate emotional escalation. When escalation does not occur, attention increases. The calm individual becomes more noticeable precisely because they do not follow the emotional script. This deviation signals strength. It communicates that the person is not overwhelmed, not threatened, and not dependent on emotional discharge for relief. Emotional restraint feels rare, and rarity heightens respect. Emotional regulation also protects communication quality. When emotions dominate, language becomes reactive. Words are chosen for release rather than precision. This often leads to exaggeration, defensiveness, or contradiction. Calm individuals maintain linguistic clarity even in difficult moments. Their words remain measured. Measured language feels intentional. Intentional language feels authoritative. Authority does not require volume. It requires coherence under pressure. Another psychological layer involves predictability. People trust what they can rely on. Emotional volatility introduces uncertainty. Others begin to anticipate outbursts, defensiveness, or withdrawal. This anticipation creates distance. Calm individuals are predictable in the best sense. Their responses are stable regardless of circumstance. Stability allows others to relax around them. Relaxation fosters trust. Trust forms the foundation of respect. Calm presence also limits manipulation. When someone reacts emotionally, they become easier to influence. Buttons can be pushed. Triggers can be exploited. A regulated individual is less vulnerable to external provocation. This resistance is felt intuitively by others. They sense that emotional tactics will not work. This boundary discourages disrespect. People are less likely to test limits when they do not expect a reaction. Importantly, emotional regulation does not mean emotional suppression. Suppression hides emotion, but does not resolve it. Suppressed emotion often leaks through tone, body language, or passive aggression. Regulated emotion is processed internally and expressed intentionally if needed. Observers can feel the difference. Suppression feels tense. Regulation feels grounded. Grounded presence communicates strength because it suggests integration rather than avoidance. In group dynamics, calm individuals often become informal leaders without trying. When tension rises, others subconsciously look toward whoever remains composed. This is an evolutionary response. In uncertain situations, humans gravitate toward those who appear least affected by threat. The calm individual becomes an anchor. Anchors are respected because they provide orientation when others feel disoriented. Calmness also reshapes power dynamics in conversation. Emotional reactivity cedes control. The reactive person is responding to external stimuli. The calm person controls pacing, tone, and direction. This control does not need to be asserted. It emerges naturally through presence. Silence paired with calmness is especially powerful. It creates space that others rush to fill, often revealing more than they intended. The calm individual gains information while remaining unreadable. Psychologically, emotional regulation is closely tied to delayed gratification. The immediate impulse to react is postponed in favor of a more considered response. Delayed gratification is strongly associated with intelligence, maturity, and long-term thinking. When someone consistently demonstrates this capacity, others assume competence in other domains as well. Respect generalizes. Calmness in emotion is taken as evidence of strength and character. Another important factor is self-respect. People who regulate their emotions communicate that their inner state is valuable and protected. They do not allow external chaos to dictate internal experience. This boundary signals self-respect. Others tend to mirror this respect. Those who react explosively or defensively often invite boundary violations because their emotional state appears accessible and influenceable. Calm presence also reduces the need for explanation. Emotional reactions often require justification. Calm responses stand on their own. They do not beg for understanding. This independence from explanation enhances authority. The individual appears self-contained. Self-containment is a core component of perceived strength. There is also a physiological contagion effect. Nervous systems synchronize in social settings. A calm nervous system can down-regulate others. People may not consciously notice this, but they feel better around regulated individuals. Feeling better around someone increases positive regard. Positive regard, when combined with respectful boundaries, becomes admiration. Over time, consistent emotional regulation builds reputation. The individual becomes known as someone who does not overreact, who can be trusted in difficulty, who remains steady when others destabilize. This reputation precedes them. Even before they speak, their presence alters the emotional temperature of the room. That influence does not come from dominance or charisma. It comes from discipline. Calmness also allows for clearer ethical judgment. Strong emotions narrow moral reasoning. Regulation keeps judgment accessible. People respect those whose decisions appear fair and considered, especially under stress. Fairness under pressure is one of the most respected human traits because it suggests integrity rather than impulse. Ultimately, calm presence commands respect because it demonstrates inner sovereignty. The individual is not owned by their emotions, their circumstances, or the reactions of others. They occupy themselves fully. This wholeness is felt immediately in interaction. People may not articulate why they trust or respect such individuals, but they do, because calmness communicates that whatever is happening externally, something stable is holding internal listening functions as a form of psychological dominance, not because it suppresses others, but because it reconfigures control within an interaction. In most conversations, power is assumed to belong to the person who speaks the most, who drives the narrative, who fills space with opinion and assertion. Psychology reveals the opposite more often than not. The individual who listens attentively while speaking selectively gains leverage by shaping the informational and emotional landscape of the exchange. Attention is not passive, it is a resource. When one person holds it deliberately, they quietly influence the direction and outcome of the interaction. Human beings are deeply responsive to being listened to. Being heard satisfies a core psychological need for recognition and validation. When someone listens without interrupting, correcting, or redirecting, the speaker experiences a sense of importance. This experience lowers defenses. Lowered defenses increase disclosure. The more someone speaks freely, the more they reveal about motivations, insecurities, priorities, and emotional triggers. The listener, by remaining quiet, gathers this information without offering equivalent exposure. This asymmetry creates advantage. Knowledge accumulates on one side while vulnerability accumulates on the other. Listening also alters pacing. The person who listens sets the tempo of the interaction by choosing when to respond. Control over timing is control over rhythm, and rhythm influences psychological dominance. When responses are delayed and measured, the interaction slows. Slowness introduces gravity. Fast exchanges feel lightweight and reactive. Slower exchanges feel deliberate and consequential. People tend to attribute authority to those who move at a slower, steadier pace, because slowness suggests deliberation rather than urgency. There is also a perceptual shift that occurs when someone listens intently. The speaker begins to adjust their behavior. They choose words more carefully. They reflect more deeply. They become aware of themselves. This self-awareness often leads to self-correction or self-disclosure without external prompting. The listener does not need to challenge or direct. The speaker does the work internally. This is a subtle form of influence that does not rely on force or persuasion. Listening creates psychological space. Space invites projection. When someone does not immediately respond with their own perspective, others fill the silence with assumptions, explanations, and elaborations. The listener becomes a blank surface onto which meaning is projected. This projection often elevates the listener's perceived intelligence or authority. People assume that silence hides depth. They attribute understanding, insight, or judgment to the person who listens without rushing to speak. Another layer of dominance emerges through emotional regulation. Listening requires restraint. It demands tolerance for silence, ambiguity, and disagreement. Those who cannot tolerate these states interrupt, defend, or redirect. Those who cannot tolerate these states interrupt, defend, or redirect. Those who can tolerate them appear stronger. Their ability to remain present without reacting signals emotional maturity. Emotional maturity commands respect because it implies self-mastery. Self-mastery is the foundation of all non-coercive power. Listening also reduces the need for persuasion. When someone feels understood, they become more open to influence. This is not because they are manipulated, but because understanding builds trust. Trust lowers resistance. The listener can then speak briefly and effectively because their words land in a receptive environment. Influence achieved through listening is often more durable than influence achieved through argument because it feels voluntary rather than imposed. In social hierarchies, listening often reverses expected roles. Lower status individuals tend to talk more to establish relevance. Higher status individuals are listened to by default. When someone chooses to listen rather than assert, they disrupt this pattern. The disruption forces others to recalibrate. The listener appears secure enough to not perform status. This security itself signals high status. Others begin to defer, not because they are instructed to, but because the interactional cues suggest it. Listening also enhances memory and pattern recognition. By absorbing more information and speaking less, the listener detects inconsistencies, repetitions, and emotional shifts. These patterns provide insight into character and intention. The listener can respond with precision later, referencing something meaningful that was previously said. This precision creates impact. It demonstrates attentiveness and depth. People respect those who remember what matters. Another dimension is that listening preserves optionality. Speaking commits one to a position. Listening keeps options open. In uncertain situations, optionality is power. The listener can choose when and how to engage without being locked into an early stance. This flexibility is often mistaken for passivity, but it is strategic restraint. Strategic restraint allows adaptation. Adaptation is a form of intelligence that commands respect. Listening also influences group dynamics. In group settings, the person who listens carefully often becomes a mediator or reference point. Others look to them for response or resolution. This role emerges naturally because listening positions the individual as someone who sees the whole rather than a part. Seeing the whole is associated with leadership. Leadership does not require domination. It requires integration. Silence while listening can also create mild discomfort in others. This discomfort is not threatening, but it is activating. People feel compelled to fill silence, to clarify, to justify. In doing so, they often reveal more than they intended. The listener gains insight without asking. This dynamic is not aggressive, but it is powerful. It shifts effort away from the listener and onto the speaker. Listening also communicates confidence in one's own value. A person who believes their perspective matters does not rush to express it. They trust that there will be space when it is time. This trust in timing reflects self-assurance. Others pick up on this assurance and adjust their behavior accordingly. They wait, they check in, they seek input. Influence flows toward the listener without demand. There is also a moral dimension. Listening is associated with fairness and respect. People respect those who respect others. This reciprocity strengthens social bonds. Strong bonds increase influence. Influence rooted in respect is more stable than influence rooted in fear or dominance. Listening achieves this stability quietly. From a neurological standpoint, being listened to activates reward pathways in the brain. Dopamine and oxytocin increase, creating positive association with the listener. These associations persist. Over time, people feel drawn toward those who make them feel heard. This draw is not emotional dependence. It is social gravity. Gravity is influence without effort. Listening also sharpens the impact of speech. When the listener finally speaks, the contrast is striking. The room adjusts. Attention shifts. The words feel earned rather than imposed. They are received as synthesis rather than opinion. Synthesis carries authority because it suggests comprehension of multiple perspectives. People respect those who integrate rather than compete. Ultimately, listening creates dominance by reversing the usual flow of attention. Instead of chasing influence through expression, the listener attracts influence through presence. They become the center of gravity, not by speaking the most, but by holding space. In that space, others reveal themselves, relationships realign, and respect forms organically because attention, once given and held, becomes the most powerful currency in human interaction. Most people scroll past ideas like this. If you didn't subscribe, it means you're paying attention. Thank you for watching this video.